McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and my co-host Jim Falk and I have a very special guest to talk to us about a world of geopolitics which is changing significantly from what he calls the order that we've dealt with, and how that particular order, I should say, is disintegrating. So, Jim, why don't you introduce our guest?
Thank you very much, Dennis, and we are certainly fortunate to have with us today Peter Zeihan. He is a geopolitical strategist who combines a deep understanding of demography, geography, trade, and energy policy, and he's going to help all of us understand better a world that I think we can all agree on is increasingly complicated. Prior to establishing his consultancy in 2012, Zeihan on Geopolitics, he worked with Stratfor, the Austin-based risk analysis firm. Peter advises a myriad of Fortune 500 companies, government trade associations, and he is a frequent speaker across the globe. He's written 3 books: The Accidental Superpower, The Absent Superpower, and his most recent book is called Disunited Nations, a Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World. Peter, great to have you with us.
A pleasure to be here.
So as Dennis said, really the premise of your latest book is we're witnessing the collapse of what we've all known as the order. I assume that's essentially like the liberal world order that we hear people talk about. Go ahead and take a few minutes and define for us what you mean by this.
Well, let's take a step back before I get to that. So international events, international politics, the international system as we think of it is a very new development. In the time until now, we've really been in an imperial age where each individual imperial power, most of them in Europe, basically went out and established a far-flung colonial imperial system. And the only trade that they tolerated was within their own system, among their colonies and to the homeland, because they never knew when someone in another country would throw a war. And even if they weren't invited to join the war, that conflict would probably disrupt supply chain systems. So you kept everything in-house and militarized it so it would be protected. And this gave us pretty much every war throughout human history, culminated into World War II, in which the empires ripped themselves to pieces. Now, at the end of World War II, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the Americans drew their allies together and said, hey, we're going to try something else, something different. We need allies to face down the Soviets in Europe because we're on the wrong continent. So we need allies who aren't going to stand shoulder to shoulder behind us or with us, but in front of us to kind of absorb that ammo as it comes in. Now, we realize that's a big ask. So we're going to pay you. We're going to use our Navy, the only one that's going to survive the war, to patrol the global oceans for anyone, so that any of you can go anywhere at any time, anywhere in the world, and interface with any partner and access any resource and sell any product. No one had ever had that kind of access before. It was as if each individual country had won the war and controlled the whole world, and all of a sudden they could access it for free. And so everybody signed on. And that was the alliance against the Soviets. And it worked, maybe a little too well, because we roll up to 1989 and 1992 and the Cold War ends. And the president we had at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, wanted to retool the order in order to achieve environmental and human rights and laissez-faire economics on a new global scale with more powers, including the defeated countries, including the third world. We voted him out of office. And in every election we've had since, the person who was less interested in international affairs has won. Until, of course, we got to these last 2, which are actively campaigning against a continuation of the order as we understand it. So the whole structure by which we have understood the world for the last 75 years is over. And the United States is not taking a leadership position in determining what's next. So the most likely end result is global depression and chaos. But remember, for the US, this was a security program. It wasn't an economic program. We never integrated our economy with the wider world, because if we had done so, we would have just been another empire and nobody would have cooperated. So when this all falls apart, the US is more or less okay. We're the least involved economy in the world, courtesy of the shale revolution. We have self-sufficiency in energy. We have the largest consumption base in the world. Mexico is the healthiest economy in the developing world. We will be more or less okay. But the rest of the world has to unwind 70 years of the most artificial developments we've ever seen in human history without any help from the outside.
In a sense, you're almost saying there is an argument for isolationism for the United States, which seems quite contrary to what we've been hearing for the last several decades.
Yes, I wouldn't use the word well, let me back that up. My books are not what I'm recommending. It's just what I see. This is a forecast. I would prefer a very different path. I like George Herbert Walker Bush's general vision for the world, but people who believe my way have now lost, 8 presidential elections in a row? It's a little depressing. But yes, if for the people who think that isolationism or retrenchment or protectionism is a good idea, now is as good a time as any. The geopolitical stars are definitely aligned for it.
But it won't always be that way. Dennis, go ahead.
Well, Peter, very good overview of where we have been and why. There are politically and geopolitically as well, a lot of people who would agree with your analysis if they understood it. And yet they would say that this order that the US created was detrimental to the United States in terms of, let's just say, supply chains going worldwide from our standpoint, lowering the high paying jobs that at least the union folks would say is the case, changing a lot of cultural issues in the United States, and that the idea of our military being in so many countries that sort of gave the other people a lot of peace, created a major problem for us, not the least of which was financial.
Yes and no. Well, actually, yes and yes. But first of all, the first yes, that's by design. If you pay someone to be on your side, that means there's a cost. And so that means that their military shrank while ours had to patrol the world. That meant that we deliberately changed our economic structure in order to benefit everyone around the world. So, for example, it's cheaper to move things on water than on land, about 1/12 the cost. And the United States, with the Greater Mississippi System, has more miles of internal navigable waterway than the combined total of the rest of the planet. That's one of the reasons why the United States did so well in World War II, for example. We could move things around our system, become wealthy, and fight a world war at the same time. That's a very rare gift that is not replicated anywhere else on the planet by an order of magnitude. It's fantastic. But that's irrelevant if your goal is to subsidize the economy of the wider system. And so when we did the order, especially with the post-Cold War order, we artificially amped up countries around the world whose geographies were not nearly as blessed as ours. So places that had no navigable waterways, places that had minimal farmland. And under the order, they couldn't be invaded by an imperial power. We would have stopped them. We did stop some. And in that environment, the less successful geographies of the world were able to rise. And so Brazil became successful, China became successful, India became successful. None of this would have happened if we hadn't done the order. So you got to choose. Do you want union jobs and manufacturing growth, or do you want to risk thermonuclear war? During the Cold War, it wasn't much of a contest. 30 years after the Cold War, it's a whole nother conversation.
Peter, do you think that the Trump administration accelerated the collapse of the order, or would it have happened in this way without President Trump? And as a follow-up, I'll go ahead and ask this now. President Biden in June met with NATO, was in Europe, and he has said all the time, America is back. So how does that affect your thesis?
Let me start from the back and work my way forward. Biden is more economically nationalist than Trump. The big difference between the two when it comes to tariffs and trade is that Trump would bring the bureaucrats that were responsible for the policy into the room, lay out his plan, and on their way out the door, he'd say, oh, and by the way, you're fired. When Biden does it, he gives them a raise. So you can kind of get an idea of what the difference is there. But the actual policies that Biden has put into place are actually far more economically nationalist versus both Europe and China than anything that Trump did. I'm on record with the Council of Foreign Relations back in 2015 saying that whoever won the next presidential election, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, was going to preside over the end of the system. We've been edging this way for a while. So Clinton was famously disinterested in foreign policy, only dealt with it for like the day that there was a summit. W had the war on terror, which absorbed all of his bandwidth and everything else dropped. Obama came in and didn't like having meetings with his own party allies, much less foreign leaders. And he became the first president in the last 80 years to not initiate, complete, or ratify a single trade deal.
But what I don't get is, isn't it in the U.S. interest to maintain the order?
Well, see, that's the question. One of the problems we have in the United States is we haven't had that conversation. We need to have a conversation on both sides of the political aisle about what it is we want to see the world look like 20, 30, 40 years from now. George Herbert Walker Bush wanted to have that conversation. He tried to have it. He brought it up during the presidential debates. And even the moderators were like, no one's interested in that. We're going to move on to domestic policy. So until we have that conversation, the best that we've been able to hope for these last 30 years have been inertia. And inertia is not politically popular. And Donald Trump was absolutely able to take full advantage of that. So we're now in a situation where we're the least economically involved country in the world. We have fewer troops stationed abroad than at any time since the 1910s, and they're going down. And we're not even capable at this moment in this country of having a conversation about the politics of foreign affairs. I'd argue that predates Trump, but in the aftermath of the January 6 riots, we certainly can't do it now. And without those three pieces in place, there's nothing to talk about. So we're waiting for, to be perfectly blunt, the next generation of political leaders, because both Trump and Biden have been around since the late Neolithic, and we need a mindset change. Not to say that we need to be more internationalist or less, but just that we're willing to discuss the issue with ourselves. And until that happens, we're just kind of in this interregnum period where no one's really in charge and the world is falling apart bit by bit.
I love the way you put that. But I think one of the things that George H.W. Bush did that turned off a lot of people was talking about a, quote, new world order.
Sure.
And there are those who believe, and I'm one of them, who this idea of a new world order smacked of international government and the lack of sovereignty. At the same time, when we sponsored China into the WTO 20 years ago, we all thought that was going to be the opening up of more liberalism in China. That hasn't been the case. And so it seems to me that making that case for the order is maybe more difficult today for at least those two reasons, among others.
Oh, yeah, we can't make the case now. The American politics have to evolve. The question on China is absolutely right. I was one of those people that just assumed that China would be like every other country that had gone through this process. And so there's reason to be optimistic. It worked for Japan. It worked for Germany. It worked for Italy. It worked for Brazil. It worked for Chile. It worked for everybody in the former Soviet bloc, except China. And China went a very different direction. And we were too late to adjust course. Now, George W. Bush second, he tried, but then 9/11 happened. And, we all know what happened for the next 20 years. America got distracted by other things. For the New World Order, let me calm you and stress you out. So first, the calming. New World Order, the concept that George Herbert Walker Bush put forward had nothing to do with international governance. He just wanted to retool what we had done during the Cold War, but instead of being the tit-for-tat security against the Soviet Union and global trade in exchange for America being able to write your security policy, it was security for international trade and access to the American market in exchange for progress on human rights, laissez-faire capitalism, and general, don't be a jerk to your neighbor. So basically taking the security parameters that we'd established during the Cold War and making them apply to everybody, so that basically we would all play nice. That was his goal. And as long as the United States Navy is more powerful than everyone else's combined by a factor of 10, nobody can force anything on the United States. So sleep well.
So a few minutes ago, you talked about how the order was assisted in a sense because we had a common enemy, and that was the Soviet Union. It seems to me that there's perhaps a campaign to have China be the common enemy. And if that's the case, what does that do with the order?
It would be theoretically possible to reboot the order to just replace all references of the Soviet Union with the People's Republic of China. I don't think it's going to happen, though. China is too economically integrated into too many countries, and breaking those connections in order to get a Cold War style containment program would result in making more foes than friends. I think it is far more likely that the United States just goes away. China is the country in the world that is most dependent upon international trade. And so all the US has to do, if the goal really is to stop China, is leave. If we stop holding up the ceiling, they can't access raw materials, the lights literally go out, and they can't sell the products that keep their people employed. And at every stage in Chinese history for the last 3,500 years, mass employment ends with a dead emperor.
I know we're going to be talking a lot more about China in our next program, but what happens to the alliances and some of the real institutions that are part of the global order? I'm thinking of NATO or IMF or even the United Nations.
Me personally, of course, I would like to see them just reformulated and reformed. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the US is just going to walk away. The IMF does not work without the US dollar, so it's gone. World Bank, same basic thing. NATO doesn't work without American troops. So what we're probably going to see is the United States, in time, will more narrowly define its interests. And there are a very short list of countries that we will seek out more lopsided bilateral relations with. So like, you want to be on our side, you have to pay to be on our side. So for example, the Japanese were approached by the Trump administration that said, you want a trade deal, that's great. You have to give us this, 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 and this, and this in the trade deal. And you have to quintuple the amount of money you give us every year in order to defend you. And the Japanese were like, sign us up. They tried to do the same thing with the Koreans, and the Koreans stalled. So, that relationship is probably going to end in the next couple of years. Same thing with Germany. But then we'll have more robust linkages with, say, the United Kingdom and with Australia, maybe New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway. All in all, you're looking at the United States having tighter relations with maybe 10% of the countries that it had during the Cold War.
Well, you talk about, in fact, you got to give credit in your book to an organization that I belonged to for a long time, the Society of International Business Fellows. And I know that they have been so happy to have you as one of their real think tank people, and vice versa. I know you've enjoyed learning from them. I was with them in China about 15 years ago, and things have changed so much there. You talk about the Navy, the US Navy, and yet we see the islands that they're building in the South China Sea. We know that the Strait of Malacca is a major possible problem there if something happens with the seaways. You seem to be more positive about our naval capacity than we do as a government, as a matter of fact.
It's really not a fair fight. Let's start with the South China Sea. We don't need it. They need it. And for them, it's just like step 1 of 14 on their way to the Persian Gulf. So if they get past that, then they have to get past Vietnam and Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and Myanmar and Sri Lanka and India and Iran. And then they arrive in the Persian Gulf. And if we're not there, they will have just as much fun dealing with the Middle East as we have. It's just what the region is like. Second, they can't get there. Yes, technically, they have twice as many ships as we do, but one of our ships outmasses 90% of theirs. I mean, size sometimes matters. Their biggest vessel, the Shandong, it's their first domestically built aircraft carrier. It's a clone of one that they bought from the Russians. It can handle about It's about 1/6 the combat capacity of our supercarriers. And we've got 12 supercarriers. It's about the same capacity, maybe about 10, 20% less than our marine amphibious units. And we have 10 of those. Most of their Navy vessels can't go more than 1,000 miles from shore. The Persian Gulf, if they're leaving from their southern ports, is over 5,000 miles. So there really is no contest here. If it came to a hot war, the US would probably withdraw all of its naval vessels a couple thousand miles from the Chinese coast. We'd capture all of their shipping all over the world. We'd cut off the entirety of the raw materials and energy import system. We'd cut off their entire export system because it all goes by water. And then we use cruise missiles and aircraft carriers to sink everything within the first island chain. And it would be over in a couple of weeks. And that's with us taking our time. So yeah, this is not something I worry about.
So what do you see as the major flashpoints right now?
If I was to pick one, the Biden administration is actively deciding whether or not it wants to boycott the Olympics. And if that happens, any American company that is sponsoring the Olympics has to pull out, which means that any American company that is still involved in China at that, the Chinese will confiscate anything that was held by the would-be sponsors, and everyone else is going to be labeled as an active sponsor of the Genocide Olympics. Right? So if the Biden administration makes this decision, a month later, it's all over.
What's your guess? Do you think there will be a real effort in the United States to boycott the Olympics?
Some form of boycott is going to happen. They're trying to decide if they want to pull participation of all the athletes, or if they just want to say that no American political representatives will be there. They really haven't made up their mind. Something to remember about the Biden administration is while a number of people on his team are very smart, Biden has never been in charge of anything, ever, his entire life. He's been a senator, but he's never actually been given the authority. Senators don't have authority to do things on their own. And when he was vice president, vice presidents only have the authority that the president gives them. So he headed some negotiations with Congress and was apparently pretty good at that during the Obama term. But that's it. So we're on our third president in a row where it's learning on the job.
Yeah, you touched on this earlier, but when you think back over the last 15, 20 years, you really had some strong people that served as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, whether it be a Biden or a Lugar or Church or others. And now it just seems as if the committee has no role. What type of problem is that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. 8 years of Obama gutted the Democratic Party and 4 years of Trump gutted the Republican Party. And what's left, the old hands who understood how things work, they're pretty much gone. So the Congress has never been the primary branch of foreign policy, but it always served as a useful check for fact-finding, if nothing else. And that's disappeared.
Yeah, it was a balance.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, Peter, the frustration that some of us have, and I've made this comment, that I believe that I and my generation have lived in a golden age. You put it in your book a little differently. You said that we've had the greatest 50 years of growth in history. So I think those things go together. And to some extent, I'm finding it hard to be optimistic for my kids and grandkids. Should I be feeling that way or not? Well,
you're in Texas, right?
I am, yes.
Yeah, okay. So short version, you're going to be fine.
And we don't have to succeed?
We don't have to succeed. We just have to linger on. We'll be fine. The United States is still the majority of private consumption in the world. So if we leave the world, we're going to have an inflation pulse in the next couple of years as we build out our industrial plant to service our own needs. And so we'll have some inflation, but it's nothing that's permanent. It's nothing that's going to kill us. Honestly, it would kind of probably do us a little good. We don't have to deal with the economic collapses we're going to see around the world unless we choose to, because we like country A or country X. We don't have to worry about security for the most part because we have oceans protecting us and the world's most powerful Navy. Doesn't mean we're bulletproof, but wow, are we out of range for most things and bullet resistant for what? We're not. Even if you're worried about cyber conflict, which to a degree I am, all you have to do is cut the cables. So, even that I'm not all that worried about. And the country in the world after the United States that has the healthiest demography is Mexico. And we're already linked in with them through a free trade deal. So if you're in Texas, not only are you at the forefront for a lot of this manufacturing reshoring, but you already have a close partner that helps you with different parts of the supply chain. This is going to be the North American century. And the closer you are to the border, the more the opportunity will be.
Well, I love what you said about Mexico. I'm not sure that given the situation with AMLO down there, that the political situation is not moving in the wrong direction. And we just have about a minute left. So give me about 30 seconds of your thoughts about Mexico's political situation, how they can blow that relationship up.
Let me underline that AMLO, Lopez Obrador, he's not a socialist, he's a populist. It's different. It's more like Trump is not a Republican, he's a populist. And in the elections that happened on June 6th, he failed to get a supermajority. So he can't amend the Constitution and remain king for life. So he is now a lame duck, and he'll be gone in 2.5 years. Now, in that 2.5 years, we're going to see a repeat of the last 2.5 years. More violence, more economic instability, more loss of growth, worse COVID, all those good things. They're not good, they're bad, but we know when it ends, 2.5 years from now.
Okay, listen, I feel better about it already. And I can assure you, and I can assure that viewer, that we're going to do a follow-up program on this, taking it from where you're talking about this global disorder into what countries are likely to look like in the future and what our lives are likely to look like in the future. So on behalf of Jim and me, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. And for you watching this program, be sure and check that next one, which will come up in about a week. Also, check it on McCuistionTV.com. You'll always find it there. Follow us on Twitter and social media, because we're always providing you with these kind of very interesting perspectives on things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.